thanks a lot, Benji, for joining. We are going to be discussing A Brave New World, IP NFTs, and BioDAOs. And so, Molecule, and then, I guess pre-seed into that, VitaDAO, and many of the projects that you spun out were incredibly, I think, impactful in the DeSci space already. I think to the extent that there is some kind of like legacy institutional reputation that you guys have built it for what that's worth in crypto. And so thanks a lot for joining. It means a lot that you're here. And I love the kind of like really wonderful series of projects that you're spinning out. You're obviously in collaboration also with LabDAO a lot. And so thanks a lot for joining. And I think it's a really nice segue from one individual project really that's doing a ton of work into, okay, let's look at this ecosystem a bit in the projects that you're spinning out. So thanks a lot for joining. The stage is yours, and I'll be in the back.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Give all the credit of the institutional reputation to the rest of the team. I just joined them, so I'm piggybacking off of what they've already created.
You can free ride off the reputation.
Yeah.
I love it.
But yeah, hopefully you'll notice, for those of you that just attended Nicholas's talk, there should be like a lot of parallels, because I think we're definitely seeing the world the same way, which is super exciting. Also, our backgrounds are pretty similar. I was also a computational biologist. I think that one of the reasons I left like traditional academic and industry research was just seeing the injustices that like patients had, where their data is just getting monetized for tens of thousands of dollars, and they're seeing very little of that value. And so I think it just upset me at a certain point. Like, yes, you can do valuable research with people's patient data, but they should see some of that value too. So that led me to the VC world and eventually to Molecule, where I basically came across Molecule and VitaDAO, and I'm not sure how many of you are not familiar with VitaDAO. So VitaDAO is basically a decentralized autonomous organization that's funding longevity research. The way I think about them is they're pooling together some of their wealth so that everyone can enjoy their wealth for longer. And the way they're doing that is just by funding like longevity research, essentially. They're kind of like this in between, like a nonprofit patient organization, but also like a for-profit venture fund in this kind of very interesting way. And the reason they're able to do this is via what Molecule has created, this primitive that's on blockchain called an IP NFT that merges traditional intellectual property with the NFT primitives that exist on chain to represent that intellectual property. So this absolutely fascinated me, and I had to red pill in. Before we talk about like what Molecule is doing to kind of change the way IP works in the future, I think it's important to understand what the challenges are of the past. I think one important piece is that like technology is advanced so much in so many different ways, but IP has just been lagging in the 18th century. I mean, if you look at how intellectual property has changed since the 1700s, it's incredibly little. And so ideally you would have a system where intellectual property traveled at the same speed as capital. But right now, if you want to do some sort of IP deal with another company, you have to get lawyers involved. It's a multi-month process. This doesn't need to be the case. It doesn't need to be limited by legal teams and how much money you have to go pay lawyers. It should be able to all be enforced on blockchains. Another problem is that IP isn't searchable. So I can't go online, search, for patents that are licensable to target this drug pathway. If I'm a biotech company, I want to license it. I have to go do hand-to-hand combat with every single technology transfer office and ask them, hey, do you have any drugs that target this disease? Incredibly inefficient. And this is wasted time, and time is super important when it comes to intellectual property, because patents have a lifetime that's finite, right? And so every day that a patent isn't searchable, its value is lost. And then I think another piece is valuing early stage intellectual property is incredibly difficult. So it kind of like what Nicholas was saying, like you don't know if something's going to be commercializable, especially at these early stages. And so because the transaction cost is higher than the expected value, there's no market, because like no one wants to go risk the amount of money it takes to go like potentially diligence a piece of intellectual property, because they're most likely going to lose money on it. What this all leads to is the valley of death, which is essentially you have these patents that are made but never licensed. They never see the light of day. Another failure of the intellectual property system as it relates to biotech specifically is just poor quality drugs. So because you have drugs and therapeutics developed in these walled gardens, you have very few people auditing the data that's coming out of them, right? So there's not a lot of people that are actually looking at it and saying, this is good data, this is bad. Here's all of the data that you can look at. They can cherry pick which studies they want to show investors just to inflate the perceived value of what they're creating. So as a result of this, there's just poor drugs. We would love for biotech to mirror open source software development, where you just have a ton of people looking at the data and picking it apart, coming up with new ideas, and being able to incentivize them to do so. So I think the last IP failure mode, I think this is an important picture because it really describes the intersection between IP and pharma very well, which is you have all of this investment into research, right? You have venture capital, you have government agencies, everyone's investing, into the early stage. You can think of this as basic research. And then you have to go run clinical trials. This in and of itself is like $100 billion per year, super, super expensive. And so this is, by the way, all developed by Peter Kolchinsky, who's at RA Capital, one of the top biotech venture funds. And he basically has said that the biotech industry has made the social contract with, at least in America specifically, because this is where it really holds true, which is we have made an agreement with the pharma industry that we're going to pay an absurd amount for drugs for a short period of time. And as a result, we're going to basically get free drugs forever. So you as a consumer in the healthcare industry, you're basically paying for drugs that will live forever and will be this arsenal that we serve humanity with. There's a few problems with this though. Number one is this is bankrupting America. Like the fraction of the GDP that goes toward drugs is so high. It's like it's in the trillions of dollars. And another is that you have the tragedy of the commons with these generics. So because IP is lost at a certain point, there's no incentive to go and further develop these drugs that are now off patent. And so the result is that you have these incredibly safe and effective drugs that aren't getting repurposed. And so there's the whole idea of tragedy of the commons. You can apply this and call it the tragedy of the generics. And so the question is, what could a different system look like if we wanted to rebuild intellectual property with cryptography? How would we do that? And so I think it's important to understand why intellectual property is important. And if you look at just the actual Webster definition of what intellectual property is, it's a work or invention that is the result of creativity, such as a manuscript or a design to which one has rights. And so I think what's interesting about this definition is this word rights. Rights are something that are given to you by a governing body, right? It's kind of a circular definition because it says, with this work or creativity, you can define what the creator gets, which is one perspective if you're thinking about a government and political institution is giving you those rights. I think where it gets super interesting is when you think about Ethereum and a network of individuals as potentially granting you those rights. And so we propose this kind of new definition where it's a work or invention that is a result of creativity where the creator gets to transact on their own terms. And I think that this is a much more interesting definition of intellectual property because you think about it as this configurable engine where it's I made this thing and I want to transact on it on my own terms rather than the terms that the government sets. And what this allows for is you to maximize human creativity because people can protect what they create. And I think that is super important if you want to maximize human creativity for common good. And so the question is, how do you basically build from an engineering layer this new world of intellectual property that's all governed on-chain by the network? And it's important to think about what are the features that you want those to have. So number one is legal. You want to have a system that's interoperable with the old legal system. Number two is storage. You want it to be decentralized storage so that there isn't a very clear attack vector where someone can go steal your idea. It needs to be highly transactable, right? You want capital to travel at the same information as speed as intellectual property. It needs to be discoverable. Like we mentioned before, the current system isn't discoverable. You need to make it so. And then the last piece is programmability, right? You want to be able to add new features to this that allow the creator to decide, what are the specific features that I want to be part of my IP transactions. And so a new system can't have 4 or 5 of these or 2 or 3 or 3 or 5. It has to have all of them or else the system will fail to the old system. And so the IP NFT as Molecule has built it. What does it do? What is the actual anatomy? So it is interoperable with the current legal system where you have kind of this IP license. That's normal. We basically license these from tech transfer offices of universities. But on the license, it literally has a reference to a public key of a non-fungible token that lives on chain. And it also has the wallet addresses of the licensors who are, DAOs theoretically. So they don't have addresses, they just have wallet addresses. And so in the smart contract, which is basically like a non-fungible token, the public key is the same thing that's on the legal contract. So you basically have this bridge from the legal world on chain. And not only can this NFT point to the legal contract, which lives on decentralized storage, but also can decrypt it. So only the owner of the NFT can basically decrypt the intellectual property and actually know the terms of the license. But yeah, at the same time, you do make it searchable with all whatever search features that you would want. How much more time do we have? I just want to make sure we're all good.
We're at 12 minutes past.
Okay, so I have 3 more minutes?
Yes.
Oh boy. Okay. So here's an example of one of the IP NFTs that VitaDAO has created, where basically they're funding research at the SENS Research Institute, which is a longevity focused group. And yeah, I think what's important to understand is this isn't a donation, right? What they're getting in return is the intellectual property commercialization rights from the research that they're funding. And this is important because they can theoretically monetize that on the back end, fund a treasury, and continue to make this research sustainable. So long as it's just grants for nothing, it's just unsustainable research. And so I think it's important that you can monetize the IP rights, because this continues to build a treasury such that the research itself can continuously be funded. And so what's next for IP NFTs? So the project I'm specifically working on is fractionalization. Fractionalization of these IP NFTs is super interesting because you create much more interesting market dynamics. One huge problem with existing IP is that there's no incentive to report negative data. So if you're a pharma company, you run 100 studies, 98 of them are garbage, and 2 of them are good. You report the 2 good ones because that's what makes your drug look good, right? But this results in poor quality drugs. And so what happens if you have fractional IP NFTs, where all of the data is super transparent, is you create a market for negative data because people can short it, right? There's no short markets in private, venture capital funded biotechs. And so there isn't this market mechanism to produce negative data. And so the result is higher quality therapeutics. So yeah, just a brief look at what VitaDAO is doing. They've funded a ton of projects. They have 55 million market cap, 7,000 members, a ton of activity. They've built this super interesting engine for sourcing and funding really high impact research. They're using pretty basic tools in the cryptocurrency blockchain world. With the addition of the IP NFT that we think is their real weapon that allows them to do this research and fund it sustainably. We can skip through some of this. They're writing big checks. They're also writing small checks. To me, making research as capital efficient as possible is where it gets interesting, because then you can just benefit from the power law, which is basically the idea that the more irons you have in multiple fires, one of those fires is going to light up and you just want exposure there, is kind of the idea. Venture capital funds place these big bets on individual companies, and so they don't get a benefit from the power law quite as much as theoretically a DAO can. Also, because the DAO has 7,000 members that are sourcing investment deals, you just benefit from the reach in a way that a centralized VC fund never would. And so decentralization actually becomes a competitive advantage here. So yeah, we have traditional pharma signing on. Pfizer just made a $500K investment into VitaDAO. And yeah, our next big project is BioXYZ. BioXYZ is basically, you can think of it as the Y Combinator of biotech DAOs. And so the idea is to find all of these interesting applications of research that are traditionally underfunded, but have these online communities already existing and paying out of pocket for research. So you have VitaDAO, where it's a bunch of people that are interested in longevity. You have SciDAO, where a bunch of people are interested in psychedelics. People are already paying out of pocket for supplements or psychedelics, but there's no structured research. The idea is to bring structured research to these research areas. Another one I'm super bullish on is HairDAO. Hair loss is super underfunded, and these guys are so desperate, and women too in a lot of cases, but it is mostly male dominated, where they're losing their hair. They have all this crypto and they're please give me answers. Seriously. And so they're funding all of this super interesting research, and they're going to dominate the hair loss space because only $5 million of money goes into this research, and they easily are going to get $5 million in their treasury. So some super interesting use cases. And yeah, the goal of this is to source more great ideas for these BioDAOs. if anyone has ideas, like, come build with us. Like we have a grant program. We give out $100K to anyone who wants to come and like leverage the primitives that we're building. And yeah, sorry for flying through that, but hope that was relatively interesting. And yeah, would love to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, now we're doing a question to like nitpick into this. I knew you would have your hand up after last night's dinner conversation. I'm so glad. I'm gonna, while we do this in the sentence way, I'm gonna run out Nick Puder, who's the next speaker.
Great.
But I think you're gonna cover it. We have more than enough questions, and I'll be back in a sec.
So I'm a bioengineer, I'm an inventor. So the thing that I'm wondering as I look at this is like, what is the difference for me between like, I have some IP, I patent it, I could put that patent into an NFT and then sell it to someone, or I could just sell it to the person. Mm-hmm. And like this seems like just more overhead, as opposed to, because like, what's the difference between putting it into an NFT and selling it versus just selling it?
The question is, what price can you get now for it versus what price could you get for it in the future if there was further development of it? And so, if you think that you can get, enough money to satisfy you up front, then great, go and license it now. If you want to further develop it with a community, then the idea is you can make an NFT out of it, get a DAO or like experts that will help you develop it and appreciate the price and the value of that asset.
Wait, but the price and the value, if you further develop the IP, even if it's just a patent, like if I file a patent and then I go do 3 more experiments that show that it works like 100 times better than we thought it does, then the value of that patent has increased, right? And so
right.
I don't understand.
But if you've already licensed it, then you've given away your economics.
Yeah, but that's true. If you sell the NFT to the person, then you've given away the economics, right? Like
not necessarily. Like basically, what you can do is the NFT. All it does is represent whatever like contract that you have. And so in the same sense, like yes, like you could go license it to a biotech company, or you could like sell it as an IP NFT. The question is there a potential buyer? Like, do you have a buyer for your IP right now?
Sure.
Maybe not. If you don't, then maybe one of these DAOs is going to provide you the funding that otherwise would not exist. So if there is funding, like great, like go get it. But if there isn't in the traditional sense, and traditional like vectors for funding, like maybe you'd want to go to a DAO that would provide you funding that otherwise wouldn't be there.
Okay.
So can I
please.
On that question too. Like here you're answering in terms of like what's the benefit of joining a DAO that will form someone research. I think if I heard the question, it's more like what is the distinction in using an IP NFT as opposed to just using IP licensing, but with regard to what I get as a benefit. And I want to answer this question as to like the initial pieces that you are giving to IP at the beginning of the talk, like how is the IP NFT but is better to a normal licensing and is better to avoiding this type of criticism?
Sure. So to answer your first question of what is the benefit to you, I think one important piece is you join a whole community. So you join a community of thousands of like enthusiasts who would potentially, like if you're in the process of drug development, who would take your drug. You have like a patient population.
Really on the IP NFT specifics.
Right, but what I mean is that whole community now has upside in your asset, right? And so that never existed before. That community where everyone has upside in your IP hasn't really existed. So they might have stock in a company if it's public, where they could potentially receive upside, but not at the earliest stages of IP development. And so they could take your drug, they could, contribute to the development of it. Kind of the same thing that Nicholas was talking about with LabDAO and, how they're trying to build these communities around research projects. You now have a bunch of people that have economic upside and want to help you make it successful.
This is the DAO benefit.
Right.
Which is the same as with us.
Right.
But I think the question is on the IP NFT specifically.
It is an instrument and a vector to provide more value to you and your IP as the researcher. So, yeah, I'm sorry if that's not coming.
I think what you're saying is basically if I wanted to make my patent public, because like I could literally put the patent into like a SPAC, or like I could like put the patent into a shell company and then try to float the shell company on a stock exchange.
Yeah.
And but like the stock exchange isn't going to float a shell company that just has some IP in it. And so you're saying if I wanted to make my IP public, basically an IP NFT is an alternative way to make the IP public. Is that right?
I mean, your patent itself is public regardless of whether you put it into an IP
But
NFT.
publicly owned, right? Not,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, publicly owned.
So if you, I see. So basically, like, it's an alternative to make your IP publicly owned as opposed to. Okay.
And
Yeah.
can you answer the second question?
Sure.
How does the NFT resolve the problem that you identified at the beginning? The value strategies.
So which one specifically? This one?
The three of them.
The three of them. So how it fixes the valley of death is you basically go to the research as it's being done. So right now, like a venture fund or a pharma company, they do some sponsored research, but very, very little. They're much more likely to just license IP once it's made. What VitaDAO and some of these other BioDAOs are doing is they're funding very basic research. And so with the intent of commercializing it too, right? So it's not just like the IP will go and then sit on the shelves at the university. They are funding the research to get the IP to then immediately license it and bring it into the world and go develop it further. So that's kind of how it tries to fix the valley of death. How it tries to fix the poor quality of drugs and the pricing is by making the data more transparent. So it's not completely transparent to where anyone can just see it, but if you buy small pieces of ownership in it or sign an NDA, then you now have the right to audit the data. And so this isn't, and not just some of the data, like all of it. So you can't just cherry pick experiments and decide like which ones you want to add. Like you're basically being forced to put all of the data on chain for everyone to audit. And so this just allows more people to dissect the data that you're creating and ask questions about it and create more value from it. And so the third piece of it, which is the tragedy of the generics, is you can create an IP NFT theoretically for a generic drug. But you don't necessarily have to tell people what your drug is if you can make certain proofs about it. So the idea here basically being that you create an IP NFT around a drug. You don't tell people what that drug is, but you can tell them what it does, meaning you can make certain proofs about it. I can make you a proof that, this drug kills this cell line in cancer with an IC50 of X, right? I can make that proof. I can say that this cures this disease with this response rate, but I don't need to tell you what the drug is. And so I think in a lot of ways, being able to protect that is super important because you can start to create like impact certificates, which some of these other groups are pioneering, where they're not necessarily trying to monetize the IP, they're trying to monetize the impact. And so being able to protect that is foundational.
But that will be still an IP NFT? If there is no IP associated with it?
Yeah, I mean, like, well, it's a trade secret, right? Like, it doesn't need to be a patent to be IP, right? Even a trade secret is IP. It could be data, right?
I mean, I'm just wondering the legal contract, what are you licensing? Like when I buy the IP NFTs, because I acquire the capacity of obtaining the
Sure.
licensing rights, like here, what are you licensing?
You're theoretically not licensing anything, you're just creating something from scratch. So the way we have done things in the past has all been with patent licenses, but that is truly like one application of a generalized framework that can be applied to trade secrets. And doesn't need to be like an IP license. That is just like it's the beachhead. Yes.
Question. Tell me how you're dealing with universities with respect to the IP NFTs, because for example, in my university, there are only two ways of getting money, either by gifts or by sponsored research agreement, where the person sponsoring has effectively zero IP rights. So what's the deal there?
So it's mostly sponsored research agreements. There are.
Have universities agreed to see IP?
So I mean, there's some massive fee, right? Like you have to pay the licensing fee. You have to pay like a royalty or milestone payments to the university, but you do get the vast majority of the royalty rights. Yes, you usually have to concede.
Is it really like ownership rights, or is it the right of first refusal or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, it's right of first refusal. Yeah.
Okay, which is very different from gift.
I mean, it's super contract dependent, right? But I think the important piece is that you do this negotiating up front. You have the right to license it on certain terms before you fund it, I think is the important piece.
And you have worked with many public and private universities?
Yeah.
Even Copenhagen University?
Yeah, the University of Copenhagen was the first one.
In the US?
No, University of Copenhagen in Denmark.
There's one US.
Yeah, there's one US. University of Washington.
Oh, okay, good, cool.
Yeah.
I think we're
Good question.
I'm transferable to different domains. So I've faced all of this stuff as an inventor and creator of a nonprofit R&D lab in the realm of kind of pro-social and collective intelligence technologies. And it's always something that I kind of avoid because I hate paperwork. Is this something you think would work in a different domain like that rather easily, or is it very tailored to the case of patents and pharmaceuticals and so forth?
I think we have just identified this as a huge market inefficiency that can validate the framework quickly. But I think the goal is to generalize it to every single field. I think we just picked the one that would be the greatest value capture the fastest. But yeah, no, the goal is to disrupt IP across disciplines. But yeah, we just think that this is a big one to if you can just solve this, you've done an incredible service to humanity. But yeah, no, ideally we generalize it as well.
I also have some tools that might help with drug discovery.
Amazing, absolutely. Thank you.
I have a very good question because I don't know much about the education licensing and so on. But talking to researchers, they always mention the pain with dealing with TTOs. So how does it look like for you guys when you negotiate?
It's just as shitty. It's no better unless one thing we're pioneering is called decentralized technology transfer. And so basically professors can spend 20% of their time consulting. And so the question is, can you raise funding to basically fund them as consultants, and then you just basically have a separate lab?
The universities will kill you.
The universities will kill you, but no, I mean it's going on, and they already consult.
But yeah.
What is your university?
The Crick Institute in London.
Yeah.
I see. The US now are becoming more open, on this. Like having
It
startups
depends.
at 20%.
It depends what the university is like.
In
in the pecking
the
order.
US, it's an
Sometimes-
IRS problem in the US because then it's nonprofit assets being used for.
No. Absolutely not. So we're not taking assets from the university. You are leveraging the professor's time as the asset.
But if the invention is based on anything that was done in the university.
No. You're 100% right.
Yeah.
All the research would be done outside. That's why.
Right, so it's just that they have an idea that is unrelated to the work that they're doing in their lab. Then you can pay them as a consultant.
Yeah, but
Yes.
also there are rules where any skills you gain because you worked at the university, so they find a way to get some rights on what you're doing because we trained you or something like that. So yeah, it's a little bit blurry, but I guess they are becoming a little bit more open about it. So I'm from UConn, and they are even encouraging us to do startups, blah, 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 and they will get small percentage.
Mm-hmm.
Some other universities, they have this skill term, and it becomes so, sorry for the word shitty when you go there. It's just like they will take the whole company because they're telling you that we trained you, we did this for you. Yeah. But yeah, this is a very interesting topic. I'm gonna have tons of questions for you, and then the
Great.
legal aspect, because when you said it is interoperable,
Mm-hmm.
it's like IP rules are different from country to country, from state to state. So I was wondering how are you handling this?
Yeah, and I think it's like going back to Nicholas's earlier point that like teams are better when they're decentralized. Which jurisdiction do you pick? Like, do you just pick the jurisdiction with the least amount of friction? Or do you just say, screw the legal system, we're going to build a completely orthogonal system that works on its own, that doesn't need a political system to enforce it? Ideally, you don't need courts to enforce this system. It works on its own. Of course, that's a tall ask. And so you'd rather be reliant on the existing legal system for a certain period of time until you can say, hey, we actually just don't even need them anymore. They're actually just holding us back. But theoretically, cryptography should be able to do everything that a government should be able to do.
Oh, yes. More on that in the last talk on gaming the future that I'll be doing. Thank you.